Zarina's hands trembled as she adjusted the long silver band that wrapped around her chest and shoulders, a ceremonial garment from her homeworld that shimmered faintly under the artificial lights of the space station. It was not simply clothing, it was a symbol of her people's heritage, a sign of respect and dignity that her family had passed down for generations. Today was her first day working at the interstellar corporation known as Orion Systems, a company run mostly by humans, but staffed by dozens of alien species from across the galaxy. And she wanted to make a strong impression. Yet as she walked down the wide corridor leading to the reception hall, her nervous steps echoed too loudly in her ears, and the looks she received from others made her second-guess every choice she had made that morning. She had dreamed of this opportunity for months, believed that this job would allow her to prove herself in a galaxy where her species was often overlooked, but already whispers and snickers followed her as if shadows clung to her back. A group of tall, scaled workers near the entrance exchanged glances before smirking openly, their laughter sharp like broken glass, and one of them muttered, "What is she wearing? Does she think she's attending a ritual instead of coming to work?" The others chuckled, their voices carrying just far enough for her to hear, and Zarina's cheeks burned though she forced her head higher, pretending she had not noticed. She had prepared herself for challenges, but she had not expected cruelty so soon. The lobby stretched wide, filled with sleek glass walls and glowing consoles where alien employees checked in for their duties. Conversations buzzed in every corner, yet she felt the eyes of too many strangers turned toward her attire, their stares weighing heavier with each passing step. An insectoid attendant behind a counter tilted its mandibles in amusement, whispering to another clerk who stifled laughter poorly. Zarina's heartbeat quickened, and though she told herself that appearances should not matter, it was impossible to ignore the mocking smiles. She reached the main desk, clutching her identification slip tightly, only to find another receptionist already waiting there. This one, a long-limbed alien with pale blue skin and elegant robes, gave her a dismissive glance before curling its lips into a sneer. "You must be the new applicant," it said in a voice laced with disdain, its words sharp enough to cut. "I suppose you thought dressing like that would impress someone. You look like a performer at a festival, not a professional." The alien's voice carried across the lobby, and a few bystanders chuckled openly, their laughter echoing like cruel applause. Zarina froze, her breath caught in her throat, but she refused to lower her gaze. She wanted to respond, to explain that her garment represented honor and strength among her people, but her words lodged tightly in her chest. Instead, she stood silently, her silence interpreted by the crowd as weakness, fueling more whispers. The blue-skinned receptionist leaned closer, its eyes gleaming with superiority. "You should have chosen something less ridiculous. No one here will take you seriously dressed like that." The words stung, sharper than she had expected, and for a moment her confidence wavered. Her thoughts raced. Had she made a mistake, coming here, into a place where cultural differences were treated as jokes rather than values? Every instinct urged her to flee, to retreat before her humiliation deepened further. But deep inside she held to a fragile spark of resolve. She remembered her mother's voice, reminding her before she left home, "You will face doubt, Zarina, but if you stand tall, they will see you for who you truly are." So she drew in a slow breath and lifted her chin, meeting the mocking receptionist's eyes with quiet defiance, though her hands trembled behind her back. The tension grew heavier, the room around her buzzing with hushed murmurs, when suddenly the air shifted. The sound of heavy, steady footsteps echoed from the far side of the hall, commanding silence as if each step carried authority carved into the floor. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter faded, and even the blue-skinned receptionist's smug grin faltered. Zarina turned her head slightly, and she saw him, the human boss, Mr. Carter, a tall figure in a dark suit whose presence seemed to press down on the room itself. His eyes scanned the lobby, sharp and unwavering, taking in every detail as though nothing escaped his notice. The employees stiffened, standing straighter, their mockery vanishing as quickly as it had begun. Zarina's pulse raced faster now, not from humiliation, but from uncertainty. What would he see when his gaze fell on her? Would he share their laughter? Or would he dismiss her without a chance to prove herself? She braced herself as his footsteps grew louder, closing the space between them. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably, its earlier confidence draining away as Mr. Carter's shadow stretched across the desk. Zarina stood frozen, the whispers still echoing faintly in the corners of the room, and she knew that this single moment would decide her future. Every ounce of courage she carried balanced on the edge of his judgment, and though she did not yet know what he would say, she refused to let the mockery define her. In the silence that followed his arrival, the weight of suspense hung heavy in the air, as though the entire lobby held its breath, waiting for his first words. The heavy footsteps of Mr. Carter echoed across the polished lobby floor, as silence swallowed the room, and every worker who had been whispering or laughing only moments ago now stood frozen in place, their earlier amusement replaced by unease. For the human boss was not the kind of man who tolerated disorder in his company. His eyes, sharp and steady like a blade honed over years of leadership, swept across the gathered crowd before settling briefly on the blue-skinned receptionist, who had been mocking Zarina, and the way the alien shrank under his gaze revealed more than words ever could. But Carter did not address them, not yet, for his attention shifted to the trembling figure standing beside the counter, Zarina, who still clutched her identification slip in her hand, her ceremonial garment shimmering faintly under the lights, as if determined to stand out no matter how harshly others judged it. For one long moment, no one dared to move, and the weight of that silence pressed down harder than any insult, until finally Carter's voice broke it, calm but commanding, a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. "What's happening here?" The question was simple, yet it carried such gravity that the receptionist's confidence shattered completely, and words stumbled out in a clumsy attempt at explanation. Something about a new applicant, about unusual clothing, about first impressions. But Carter raised one hand, and the alien's excuses died instantly in their throat. He turned back to Zarina, studying her closely. Not just the garment she wore, but the way she held herself, shoulders straight though her hands trembled slightly, eyes determined though the sting of humiliation lingered in them. In that instant, he saw what others had missed, a strength hidden beneath quiet dignity, a will that refused to break even when surrounded by ridicule. And then, without hesitation, Carter spoke words that would change the course of her life and silence the entire room. "Hire her." Right now, the command landed like thunder, leaving the aliens around them stunned, their mouths hanging open. In disbelief, they had expected laughter, perhaps dismissal, but not this, never this. And the blue-skinned receptionist blinked as if uncertain whether it had heard correctly. But Carter's gaze was firm, his voice carrying no trace of doubt, and the authority in his tone left no room for argument. Still, the silence stretched as if the weight of his decision took time to settle into the minds of those present, until one of the scaled workers who had laughed earlier muttered under his breath, "But sir," he got no further, for Carter's eyes snapped toward him with such intensity that the words dissolved instantly, and the worker fell silent, shrinking back as though struck. Zarina herself stood frozen, her thoughts racing, unable to believe what she had just heard. He wanted to hire her, just like that, without asking for qualifications, without doubting her worth because of her appearance. Confusion mixed with relief inside her, but beneath it all, a flicker of something stronger ignited a hope she had not dared to nurture until now. Yet even as that hope grew, she could sense the simmering resentment around her. The mocking aliens exchanged uneasy glances, their pride wounded, their judgment overturned so suddenly, and she knew that this moment, though it spared her humiliation, had also painted a target on her back. Still, she refused to look away, refused to bow under the pressure, for the man who now defended her seemed to demand nothing less than resilience. Carter turned again to the receptionist, his voice low but firm, reminding it of the company's creed. "We don't judge by appearance here. We judge by strength, by resolve, by what a person can endure. If you can't understand that, then perhaps you are in the wrong place." The words struck like a blow, and murmurs spread through the gathered workers. For rarely did he speak so openly, rarely did he expose disappointment in his staff. But when he did, his words carried weight that lingered far longer than anger ever could. Slowly, Carter gestured for Zarina to follow him, and though her knees felt weak beneath her, she obeyed, walking beside him through the hushed crowd, every step echoing louder than the mocking laughter that had greeted her earlier. The corridor ahead seemed endless, the stares of others pressing into her back, yet she felt strangely steadier now, as if his presence shielded her from the scorn that had nearly broken her spirit. Moments before, he led her into a quieter chamber, away from the curious eyes, and there he finally turned to face her fully. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply observing her as though weighing truths invisible to anyone else. Then he spoke, his tone softer now but still unwavering. "You endured mockery without breaking. That tells me more about you than any resume ever could. This place is difficult, harsher than most realize, and I need people who don't crumble under pressure. That's why I told them to hire you." Zarina swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into her. And though part of her wanted to ask why her clothing had mattered so much, another part already knew the answer. It had not been the garment, but her reaction to the ridicule that had drawn his attention. She lowered her gaze briefly, gratitude filling her chest, then lifted her eyes again with renewed resolve. But Carter was not finished. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze unyielding. "Understand this, I didn't shield you. I tested them. And I tested you. They failed. You didn't. That's why you are still standing here." His words struck her deeper than any insult had, for they carried both warning and recognition. She realized now that her true challenge was only beginning, that she would have to prove herself not just to him, but to those who resented his choice, to those who had laughed and now simmered with silent envy. She nodded once, firmly, accepting that truth. Carter studied her another moment before straightening again, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured toward the door. "Your position starts immediately. But remember, your strength will be tested again and again. Do not forget. This moment, endure, and you'll find your place here. Break, and you'll prove them right." With that, he dismissed her, leaving her standing in the quiet room, her heart pounding not with fear but with determination. For the first time since she had entered the building, she believed she might truly belong, though the path ahead promised no ease, only struggle. As she stepped back into the hall, the whispers began again, softer this time, tinged not with laughter but with something sharper: envy, suspicion, even fear. She ignored them, walking steadily toward her new post. And though uncertainty shadowed her every step, she carried with her the echo of Carter's words, a reminder that her battle was not over but had only just begun, and that suspense, the knowledge that unseen trials waited around the next corner, clung to her, like the shimmer of her ceremonial garment, refusing to fade. When Zarina returned to the reception floor the following morning, the memory of the human boss's command still echoed in her mind like thunder. Yet the atmosphere around her felt heavier than before, as if every pair of eyes carried judgment, sharpened overnight. And though no one dared to laugh openly after Carter's intervention, their whispers followed her like shadows, clinging to every step. For resentment had replaced mockery, and resentment was often more dangerous than ridicule. She took her seat at the reception console, her ceremonial garment now neatly adjusted, though she noticed the others exchanged sly glances, wondering if she would falter under pressure when left to handle real tasks. And it was in this tense silence that Mr. Carter appeared once more, his tall figure striding through the hall with the calm assurance of a man who never questioned his authority, his gaze sweeping across the workers until it settled on her. Without hesitation, he approached, his footsteps measured, his presence impossible to ignore. And when he stopped in front of the desk, he did not speak to the others but fixed his eyes directly on her, his expression unreadable, his silence heavier than any command. For a moment, Zarina feared she had already disappointed him somehow, that his decision the day before had been made in haste and he was now reconsidering. But then his voice cut through the air, steady and low, carrying a weight that made every alien within hearing distance lean closer in curiosity. "Do you know why I hired you?" The question struck her harder than she expected, for it was not the kind of question she thought she would face so soon, and her mind raced for an answer. Her qualifications, her training, her languages, but Carter's eyes told her he wanted something deeper. She hesitated, then shook her head slightly, admitting her uncertainty, and he nodded once, as though expecting that answer. "I hired you," he continued, his words calm but deliberate, "because you stood in silence while they mocked you. You did not lash out. You did not break. You endured. That told me more about your strength than any resume could." The room grew quieter as his words spread, even to those pretending not to listen, and a ripple of unease passed through the gathered workers, for they realized that their mockery, meant to break her, had instead become the very reason for her hiring. Zarina felt her chest tighten with a strange mix of relief and fear, for though his words gave her value, they also placed a burden on her shoulders heavier than before, a burden of expectation, and Carter seemed to sense this, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned closer. "Understand this," he said firmly. "I gave you a chance, not protection. From here on, what happens will be on you. If you fail, they will use it to justify their doubts. And if you succeed, they will resent you even more. Either way, you will walk a path of resistance. The only question is whether you have the resolve to keep walking." His words were not cruel, but they stripped away any illusion of safety, laying bare the truth of her position, and though her throat felt dry, she nodded slowly, determination flickering in her eyes despite her nerves. Carter studied her for another moment, then, as though satisfied, turned his gaze toward the watching employees. "And as for the rest of you," he said, his voice rising slightly, cutting through the air like a blade, "remember this: strength is not in what you wear or how you appear, but in how you endure. I will not tolerate weakness disguised as arrogance. If you doubt my judgment, prove yourselves through action, not whispers." His words struck hard, leaving no space for rebuttal, and though no one dared to speak, the resentment thickened, boiling beneath the surface, for many of them felt humiliated that he had chosen her over them, and humiliation often led to quiet revenge. Carter, however, seemed unconcerned, his expression cool as he straightened and turned away, leaving behind silence that felt like a storm waiting to break. And though he did not look back, his voice carried one last command as he walked toward his office. "She is one of us now. Treat her as such." With those words, he disappeared through the doors, and the reception hall exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. Zarina sat still, her hands trembling beneath the desk, her mind replaying every word he had spoken, and though his acknowledgement gave her a strange, fragile strength, the glares of her co-workers reminded her that she was still very much alone. The receptionist who had mocked her the day before avoided her eyes now, but its stiff posture and clenched jaw revealed a simmering fury, while others whispered quietly, their glances sharp as daggers. She knew they would not forgive her easily, for becoming the center of the human boss's attention, for being defended so openly when none of them had ever received such words from him, and that knowledge settled in her chest like a cold weight. Yet beneath the fear was something else, resolve, raw and unshaped, but real, and it whispered to her that perhaps endurance itself could be her weapon, that perhaps Carter had seen in her not just survival but the potential to rise above those who wished her to fail. And so she sat there, still trembling but refusing to bow her head, while around her the storm of quiet hostility gathered strength, unseen but inevitable, promising that the true test of her place in this company was only beginning. The next week arrived with an air of unease that wrapped itself around every corridor of Orion Systems, for while Zarina had been officially added to the roster, her presence remained like a spark in dry grass, watched carefully by those who wanted to see her flame out, and Carter, true to his word, wasted no time in testing whether his instinct about her strength had been correct, summoning her to his office with a tone that revealed nothing of approval or disapproval, only purpose. The office itself was vast, its walls lined with star maps and glowing panels that displayed shifting routes of trade and diplomacy across the galaxy, and when she entered, she felt the weight of that room pressing down upon her, a reminder that the company's reach extended far beyond the walls of the station. Carter stood by the large window that overlooked the black stretch of space, dotted with distant stars, his hands clasped behind his back, and without turning to face her he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You wanted to prove yourself. Then here's your chance." Slowly he turned, his gaze sharp as ever, and placed a small glowing datapad on the desk between them. "Our company is negotiating with a delegation from the Trenix Confederacy. They are difficult partners, proud and easily offended, and the talks have stalled because of miscommunications. You will be placed on the communications team. It will be your task to ensure their messages are delivered clearly, without insult, and without error. If you succeed, the delegation will trust us again. If you fail, this company could lose years of progress, and I will hear about it." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of responsibility, and Zarina felt her pulse quicken, for this was no simple clerical duty, but a role that carried stakes she could hardly believe had been given to her so soon. Yet she saw in his eyes that this was no accident, that he had chosen this path deliberately, not to shield her but to thrust her into the fire and see whether she would endure. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the task, and when she lifted her gaze again, determination had replaced hesitation. Carter studied her for a moment longer, then dismissed her with a simple nod. But as she left the office, she could feel the eyes of others following her, those who had heard whispers of her assignment, their expressions dark with envy and disbelief. How could a newcomer, mocked only days before, be entrusted with such responsibility while they, seasoned workers, remained on routine tasks? Their resentment thickened into something sharper, and Zarina felt it in the way conversations died when she walked into a room, the way footsteps lingered behind her in the halls, as though waiting for her to falter. The first meeting of the communications team did nothing to ease that pressure. She entered the chamber to find several of the same aliens who had mocked her earlier seated around a circular table, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes gleaming with quiet hostility. One of them, a scaled worker with piercing yellow eyes, leaned back in his chair and smirked as she took her seat. "So," he said in a low voice that carried just enough for the others to hear, "the human boss's favorite joins us. Let's see how long that favor lasts." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but Zarina kept her gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The assignment began at once, and it was as difficult as Carter had promised. The Trenix Confederacy representatives were exacting, their language filled with subtleties and layered meanings, where one misplaced word could be interpreted as an insult, and the communications came in streams of hurried transmissions that required careful listening, translation, and response. Zarina worked tirelessly, her hands moving swiftly across the console, her mind balancing between precision and instinct, drawing upon the deep cultural training of her own people, who had long valued the art of layered meaning and respectful exchange. Yet as she worked, she noticed small obstacles appearing, files misplaced, translations tampered with, instructions altered slightly to lead her into error. At first, she thought these were mistakes, but the smirk on the scaled worker's face when she nearly delivered a mistranslated phrase told her otherwise. Sabotage. Her co-workers were testing her too, not just Carter, and their goal was not to see her succeed, but to watch her stumble so they could whisper to the boss that his choice had been wrong. The realization hit her like cold water, but instead of panicking, she sharpened her focus, double-checking each phrase, trusting her instincts where the data felt corrupted, and slowly, carefully, she turned their traps into nothing more than empty gestures. Hours turned into days, and each meeting with the Trenix delegation grew more intense. Their voices sharp, their demands steep, but Zarina's calm replies and careful translations kept the negotiations alive, though the others glared at her. In frustration, she pressed on, driven by the echo of Carter's words, "Endure," and endure she did, though exhaustion gnawed at her, though doubt whispered that perhaps she was only delaying the inevitable. Still she sat, still she translated, still she fought not with force but with patience. And by the end of the week, the delegation had agreed to resume formal talks. A small but crucial victory. The news spread quickly through the station, and with it came a shift in the whispers. Some now spoke of her skill, grudgingly acknowledging her success, while others only grew more bitter, their envy deepening into hostility. Yet Zarina did not celebrate, for she knew this was only the beginning. Carter's test had proven her resilience, but it had also marked her more clearly as different. as someone who would not break as easily as they had hoped, and such strength often drew sharper opposition. As she left the chamber after that final meeting, her steps steady, but her body weary, she felt the eyes of her co-workers on her once more, colder than before, and she realized with a chill that though she had passed the first trial, the storm gathering around her was only growing darker, and the true test of her endurance had only just begun. Zarina's small victory in the negotiation chamber was not celebrated with cheers or congratulations, but with silence, a silence that felt heavier than scorn. For while a few grudging whispers acknowledged her skill, the majority of her co-workers recoiled even further, their pride wounded by the fact that an outsider, one they had mocked, had steadied the company's most fragile dealings. And this silence followed her like a shadow in the days that came after, reminding her that though she had survived Carter's first test, she now stood on a narrow edge, admired by none, watched by all. Carter, however, had not overlooked her effort, and though his face remained unreadable, he summoned her again to his office, this time not to question her but to measure her, his sharp eyes resting on her with a weight that seemed to pierce past the exhaustion she carried. "You endured," he said simply, his voice steady and cold. Yet there was a flicker of approval beneath the surface, a faint light that only someone desperate for hope would notice, and Zarina clung to it silently. As he continued, "But endurance is only the beginning. You are not here to survive, you are here to prove you can lead where others falter." With those words he dismissed her, and though he gave no new assignment that day, his challenge echoed in her mind like a riddle, pressing on her heart as she returned to her quarters, where the dim lights offered little comfort. She lay awake that night, her thoughts racing, the silence of her room broken only by the hum of the station systems, and in that stillness doubt began to seep in, whispering that perhaps the others were right, that perhaps her success had been nothing but luck, that Carter's faith in her was misplaced, and that sooner or later she would stumble in a way that could not be hidden. These doubts gnawed at her, sharper than any cruel words, for they came not from her enemies but from within herself, and each day as she walked through the corridors she felt the weight of them, dragging at her steps, making her question whether she truly belonged in a place where every eye was waiting for her to fail. The next trial came not from Carter, but from the station itself, for Orion Systems was no ordinary company. It was the lifeline of trade routes and peace treaties that held fragile alliances together, and one sudden breach of trust could shatter balance across entire sectors. A crisis soon erupted when a shipment bound for the Voron Alliance went missing, an entire cargo transport vanishing without signal or trace, and whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire, for the Voron were quick to suspect treachery, and if the situation was not resolved swiftly, warships might gather at their borders. Carter assembled a small investigation team to uncover the truth, and to the surprise of many, he placed Zarina at the heart of it. Her task not only to translate reports, but to sift through fragmented transmissions for patterns that others had overlooked. It was an assignment that thrust her directly into the storm, and as she joined the team in the data chambers, she once again felt the cold stares of her peers, some openly scoffing that Carter's favorite had been given another important role, others whispering that if she failed this time, she would drag them all down with her. Yet instead of faltering, she set her mind to the work, combing through fractured signals, scattered bursts of static, and half-broken logs, piecing them together with a patience that seemed endless. Though the hours drained her strength and the fatigue weighed upon her bones, slowly a pattern emerged, something hidden in the chaos, a faint signal buried in the static that suggested the transport had not been destroyed, but redirected, lured off course by a carefully masked beacon. She presented her findings hesitantly, expecting mockery, but Carter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with focus as he listened, then gave a single sharp nod. "Follow it," he ordered, and the team scrambled to act, suddenly forced to acknowledge the alien they had dismissed so often. The trail led them into uncharted territory, a system where pirate clans were known to operate, and with each passing hour tension thickened, for if Zarina's reading was wrong, they would not only fail but perhaps walk into an ambush. The ship creaked and hummed as they descended into the system, and the crew sat tense at their stations, glancing at Zarina as though her very presence carried their fate. She felt their eyes, felt their doubt, but forced herself to remain calm, her hands steady on the console as she guided the readings. Then the scanners lit up, revealing the stolen cargo transport, held in the grip of a hidden outpost built into the shadows of an asteroid field. The room erupted in movement as Carter ordered the recovery operation, and though resistance was fierce, the mission succeeded, the cargo reclaimed, and the fragile trust with the Voron preserved. When they returned to the station, news of Zarina's role spread once again, and though some still grumbled, others began to see her differently. No longer just the mocked receptionist, but someone who had guided them through danger. Yet Zarina herself felt no triumph, for though she had risen above doubt, the memory of it still lingered, and she knew that each success only sharpened the knives of those who waited for her to stumble. Still, as she walked back through the silent corridors that night, her steps were steadier than before, her eyes brighter, for though the storm had not passed, she had begun to understand Carter's challenge, that endurance was not enough, that only by proving she could rise again and again, no matter the weight of doubt or scorn, could she truly claim her place in a world where strength was not given but carved from struggle. Zarina had thought the storm had passed after the recovery of the Voron cargo, but the true test had only just begun, for whispers reached the station that a hidden faction within Orion Systems itself had been behind the theft, seeking to profit from chaos and push the company into private control. And suddenly the tension that hung in the air was no longer between alien races, but within the very walls of the place she worked, every face around her a mask that could be hiding betrayal, every step through the echoing corridors a reminder that someone was watching her. Carter called her once more to his office, and his voice, low and controlled, carried a weight that chilled her, for he revealed that he had known of the corruption, but had kept silent, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself. And now that it had, he intended to strike, but not alone, for he had chosen her, the one mocked by all, to stand beside him as proof that trust could be built not on prejudice or titles, but on strength earned through fire. Shock swept through her, and though fear pressed hard against her chest, she saw in his eyes that he meant it, that every trial he had given her had not been a test of skill alone, but of loyalty, of endurance, of the ability to rise when others would have broken. Together they moved into the heart of the storm, Carter using his authority to unmask the conspirators, while Zarina uncovered the coded transmissions they had hidden in the company's networks, her fingers moving quickly as the evidence unraveled like a thread pulled from a web. The betrayers, caught off guard, lashed out desperately, trying to frame her as the culprit, shouting that the alien receptionist had been their weakness all along. But Carter silenced them with a voice that carried across the chamber, declaring, "She is the reason Orion still stands. Without her, we would already be broken." The room froze at his words, and for the first time Zarina felt the eyes of her peers not with scorn or suspicion, but with dawning realization, as though they were seeing her not as an outsider, but as someone who had walked through fire and carried light back with her. The conspirators were removed, their plans shattered, and when the silence finally fell, it was not heavy with judgment, but filled with an uneasy respect, one that grew slowly into something stronger as days passed. Zarina, once mocked and ridiculed, stood now as a figure who had proven not only her worth but her place. And though she knew there would always be challenges ahead, she no longer carried the weight of doubt alone, for she had carved her space in the company and in the hearts of those who had once waited for her to fail. In the final quiet of that long battle, Carter approached her, his stern expression softened by something close to pride, and he said the words she had never thought she would hear. "You are no longer here because I said hire her, you are here because you earned it." And with those words the long shadow of her mockery was gone, replaced by a light that burned with possibility. And as Zarina walked forward into the endless corridors of Orion Systems, she did so not as the alien receptionist they had laughed at, but as the one they could never again deny.